the proof that Kadyrov is back was a video that was shown 2 days ago of Kadyrov at a dining room table with the head of the Russian parliament. And Makhmed Daoudov, and Daoudov was saying, well, everybody's talking about Kadyrov being sick and absent and all this and that, but here he is right here. And then they show Kadyrov and he's laughing about how they weren't really looking for me. But I found it interesting, and of course I'm not an expert at looking at videos, and this wasn't that clear, but he didn't look great. Kadyrov is the president of Chechnya, and it's part of a realm. His father was president of Chechnya, and when he died, eventually Ramzan Kadyrov inherited his mantle. So it's sort of a dynasty in Chechnya. And you remember that when Putin first became president in Russia, when he was prime minister in 1999, one of the signature features of his ascendancy to the presidency was going after the Chechens. And it was a terrible war. They accused the Chechens of this terrorism. And so I think that for Putin, Chechnya has always been a sort of, in some ways, kind of a focus, because it's one of the republics that is just, in some ways, caused a lot of unrest. Of course, they were separatists before that. A lot of Chechens did not want to be a part of Russia. So I think that Putin and Ramzan Kadyrov are tied, because Ramzan Kadyrov doesn't share any separatist tendencies. He's a strong man. He's kind of like Putin's man in Chechnya to prevent anything from going wrong. Kadyrov has been variously called Putin's monster or Putin's Chechen dragon. That was a phrase coined by Anna Politkovskaya, and she was the journalist who was murdered in 2006. And there's a lot of evidence that she had been covering, Politkovskaya had been covering the Chechen War, and very critical of Kadyrov. And there's a lot of evidence that it was actually Chechens who shot her down in her apartment building. So that's just sort of a backdrop. But Putin has depended on, Kadyrov is a monster, because the way he rules Chechnya, he's very brutal. They have a huge campaign against homosexuality. There's no observance of any real law. I mean, it's a little mini dictatorship. And Kadyrov carries out, or his forces carry out assassinations on the Kremlin's behalf. And again, we don't have a direct documentary proof of all of these, but it's pretty clear that Chechens are often used when the Kremlin wants to get rid of a troublesome political opponent, in outside Russia or inside Russia. So Kadyrov is pretty bad. First of all, in my view, Putin was ultimately behind it. Nemtsov was very, very critical of Mr. Putin. And he had just published a long report that was devastatingly critical of Mr. Putin. He was Putin's, probably his prime political opponent at that point. But Nemtsov was also very popular, and he had a lot of Democrats behind him. So I think that most probably there's a little wink and a nod to Kadyrov, get rid of this guy, because they can come into not Kadyrov himself, but his men, have ways of they get into Moscow and they carry out this crime. So Yeah, I think, and also just by, of course, Nemtsov was critical of Kadyrov as well. A lot of the Democrats were very critical of Kadyrov because by this time, when this was 2015, I mean, his little Chechen republic had become a dictatorship. It's a two-way relationship. There's no doubt about that. Kadyrov is totally dependent on Putin to remain in power. That's clear. Um, but on the other hand, Putin relies very heavily on Kadyrov. So, of course, it's Putin who ultimately is calling the shots. But it's interesting because in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of Putin and Kadyrov together. And Putin even calls Kadyrov his friend. So there is an element. I mean, I'm sure. Again, I shouldn't say that I'm sure, but Putin probably doesn't like Kadyrov. It would probably be pretty hard to like Kadyrov, but I think that there's just this feeling that he has to portray this friendship because he does rely on Kadyrov so much. Now, getting back to this question of Kadyrov's illness or something, there would be other people who could replace Kadyrov, but it's not that easy. This is a whole clan, family in Chechnya, and there are some rivalries and so on and so forth. So from the standpoint of Putin, he wants to keep this guy Kadyrov there as long as possible. But to answer your question, if who really has the power in the relationship, of course Putin does. Kadyrov's illness, and it's pretty well documented now. This is not the first time that he has disappeared inexplicably. And this isn't his style, by the way. If you look at his Telegram channel, every day he's showing pictures of himself. I mean, he's a very out there leader. Okay, so when he goes absent, there's definitely a problem. And if you have a government that's ruled by sort of a cult of personality like this, it's very important that Kadyrov is visible and there, because then people wonder. Okay, so I think going back to 2023 is when there started to be some questions about his health, and at one point, Kadyrov was a lot of Kadyrov's government plane was flying from Grozny to Moscow. And then there were a lot of Chechen cars with Chechen license plates around the presidential hospital and so on and so forth. So we knew that Kadyrov had been getting some sort of treatments. That was pretty clear. Then he sort of seemed to get better. But then since then, I think it was in January 2024, there were more signs of this illness, and that, he was, and he has acknowledged getting treatments. Nova Gazeta, the independent media outlet, has said that they've documented this pretty well, that Kadyrov has been ill with something called pancreatic necrosis since about 2019. And so clearly it's getting more severe. And I think that people are now beginning to talk about the possibility of a replacement. And it's interesting because the proof that Kadyrov is back was a video that was shown 2 days ago of Kadyrov at a dining room table with the head of the Russian parliament, and Makhmed Daoudov, and Daoudov was saying, well, everybody's talking about Kadyrov being sick and absent and all this and that, but here he is right here. And then they show Kadyrov and he's laughing about how they weren't really looking for me. But I found it interesting, and of course I'm not an expert at looking at videos, and this wasn't that clear, but He didn't look great. And so, of course, it's always, he's not dead yet, so they can pull him up and dress him up and show him. But I think the bottom line is his health is declining, and there is, there is going to be some sort of a succession at some point. He's been sort of grooming his sons. He has two sons, one who's, I think, around 18 and the other who's around 16. And I think, the ideal plan would be that he can stay alive until his sons are kind of old enough to actually take over. But right now, that's it's difficult to say. But there are. I mentioned the head of the Chechen parliament. That's Daudov. That's one possibility. And there are a couple of other Chechen leaders who have also been mentioned. But there are also rivalries among some of these leaders. And so it's, to be honest with you, I don't know quite how a succession process would play out, but I can pretty much assure you that the decision as to who would succeed Kadyrov will be made by Putin and the Kremlin. One of the rumors about Kadyrov's absence was, well, they said sort of officially that this recent absence that we discussed, that he was on vacation. And so he had allocated his duties to Daudov and the head of the Russian parliament. And then there was speculation that he was in Dubai. Apparently, Kadyrov does go to Dubai fairly often. Again, I haven't seen actual documentation, but it's said that he does. And one of his cousins has a great deal of money, as does Kadyrov, and apparently he's bought up quite a few properties in Dubai. So that's sort of a place where they can go safely. But it's interesting because this is another example of kind of the lavish lifestyle. Of this ruling family group, because, as I said, the situation of ordinary Chechens is pretty grim. They're poor. A lot of them are backward. It's not a progressive, not a republic that is in any way progressive economically. And so you have, these poor people who are all, supposedly devoted to Kadyrov, and then, his and his family's massive wealth. So clearly, some of the money, a lot of the money from the Kremlin is going into their pockets. But of course, it's a price Putin has to pay. And so it's overlooked. Kadyrov's regiments, the Ahmad regiment, are very important to the fighting in Ukraine. And I think that this is another reason why the Kremlin, is still supporting Kadyrov, because they've played quite an important role, and will continue to play that role as long as the Ukraine conflict continues. But I also should add that within the Kremlin, not all of Putin's Siloviki, or strongmen, as we call them, are favorable towards Mr. Kadyrov. In fact, there was a kind of almost an open conflict with words between Kadyrov and the head of the investigative committee, a man named Bestrikin, and also with the head of the internal forces. So Kadyrov is not universally approved of by Putin's colleagues, although he does have very close relations with the head of the Russian National Guard, Zolotov. So that's just an additional thing to consider if something happened to Kadyrov, that it might not, there might be different views about who should succeed him. But of course, Putin would ultimately control that decision.